Good morning. I'm Scott Finley, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's service on this beautiful autumn morning on the second Sunday of November. Today, I'm excited to see and hear many of you in the sanctuary, and also glad to see so many of you joining us in the Zoomiverse with me. Again, we do appreciate your patience as we work through the evolution of our hybrid services as we continue to improve and figure out what works and what doesn't, while trying to create the best worship environment we possibly can for all of us, wherever we may be. In today's service, you'll see Reverend Denise presenting her sermon titled When History or Life is Hard to Hold. Claire will be reading a story for our Time for All Sages. Jesse is our Zoom host today. Karen is Zoom co-host, and Sandy will be lighting our beautiful chalice display. If you have pastoral care needs, please reach out to Reverend Denise at the email address on your screen. That is revdenise@gnuc.org. Now Sandy will light our chalice while Reverend Denise reads these chalice lighting words from Andrew C. Kennedy.
On this happy morning, our chalice lighting words were written by Andrew C. Kennedy. We come to love a church, the traditions, the history, and especially the people associated with it. And through these people, young and old, known and unknown, we reach out, both backward into history and forward into the future, to link together the generations in this imperfect but blessed community of memory and hope. Welcome.
Thank you. Our covenant brings to mind the warmth, wisdom, and truth of our congregation. Please join me in reading our covenant if you are so moved. We covenant together to make a welcoming community, to walk together in the way of truth and love, to seek the life of the Spirit as it is known by each person, to support each other in thought, word, and deed as we work to build a better world. This morning's opening hymn is number 1228, For All That Is Our Life, and the video performed by the First Unitarian Church of Baltimore. Please sing along as you are so moved. For this morning's Time for All Sages, Claire has agreed to join us and read a story. Good morning, Claire.
Good morning. So this month, November, is Native American Heritage Month. And another way that we can describe Native American people is indigenous. And indigenous means the people that were in a place originally. So a lot of us, our ancestors, either came by choice or by force from somewhere else. But the Native Americans, the indigenous people, were here in the Americas originally. And there was also something that happened in history that we're still learning about, and it was called residential schools. And it was mostly in Canada, where indigenous people were sent to these boarding schools to try to assimilate them into the ideas of white Christianity that were popular at the time and still remain popular in certain areas. But assimilate means they tried to make them like them. So indigenous culture, indigenous traditions, indigenous religion, they said, you can't have that, you have to do what we do. So this is a story about that. And it's actually written by an author from the Cree Nation, and his name is David A. Robertson, and it's illustrated by an illustrator from the Cree Métis Nation, and her name is Julie Flett. It's called When We Were Alone. Today, I helped my kukum in her flower garden. She always wears colorful clothes. It's like she dresses in rainbows. When she bent down to prune some of the flowers, I couldn't even see her because she blended in with them. She was like a chameleon. Newcomb, why do you wear so many colors? I asked. Newcomb said, well, Nusasim, when I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I wore many different colors. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they gave us different clothes to wear. All the children were dressed the same, and our clothes weren't colorful at all. We all mixed together like storm clouds. Why did you have to dress like that? I asked. They didn't like that we wore such beautiful colors, Newcomb said. They wanted us to look like everybody else. But sometimes in the fall, when we were alone and the leaves had turned their warm autumn hues, we would roll around on the ground. We would pile the leaves over the clothes they had given us, and we would be colorful again. And this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said, I always wear the most beautiful clothes. After I helped with the flowers, we went over to the back gate. There were vines covering the gate, and they reached all the way to the ground. When my kukum turned to fix the latch, I saw that her braid hung almost as low as the vines. It was like she had a tail. Newcomb, why do you wear your hair so long? I asked. Newcomb said, well, Nusasim. When I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I grew our hair long, just like our people have always done. It made us feel strong and proud. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they cut off all our hair. Our strands of hair mixed together on the ground like blades of dead grass. Why did you have to wear your hair like that? I asked. They didn't like that we were proud, Newcomb said. They wanted us to be like everybody else. But sometimes in the spring, when we were alone and the grass had grown so long and thick in the field, we would pick the blades from the ground. We would braid them into the short hair they had given us, and we would have long hair again. And this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said, I always wear my hair very long. After my kukum had fixed the latch, I followed her to the birdhouse. There was a bird flying through the air like a jingle dress dancer. She fed the bird and whispered, Na kinesis mikaso, tamasikatian, tamaskaisian. and her words sounded like a poem. Newcomb, why do you speak in Cree? I asked. Newcomb said, well, Nusissum, when I was your age, at home in my community, my friends and I always spoke our language. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they wouldn't let us speak our words. All the children used their strange words, and we didn't understand them at all. Our voices blended together like a flock of crows. Why did you have to talk in their language? I asked. They didn't like that we spoke our language, Newcomb said. They wanted us to talk like everybody else. But sometimes in the summer, when we were alone and our teachers weren't anywhere around the place we would whisper to each other in Cree. We would say all the words we weren't allowed to say so that we wouldn't forget them. And this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said, I always speak my language. After our gardening work was done, I sat with my kukum in the backyard. Her brother came over and sat with us. He comes over all the time. We drank tea and ate bannock. The tea was hot and sweet, and the bannock was moist and warm and melted in my mouth. My kukum and my uncle talked and laughed like children. Newcomb, why do you and Newcommiss always spend time together? Newcomb said, well, Nusissum, when we were your age, at home in our community, being with family was the most important thing. We played with each other, did chores together, and shared everything. But at the school I went to, far away from home, they wouldn't let us be together. My brother and I were separated like day and night. Why were you and Newcommiss separated? I asked. They didn't like when we were with family, Newcomb said, because when we were together, we thought too much of home. But sometimes in the winter, when we were alone and we were sure that nobody could see us, we would find each other. We would take off our mitts, and in the crisp, cold air, we would hold hands so we could be with each other. And this made us happy. Now, Newcomb said as she reached over and held my uncle's hand and mine, I am always with my family.
Thank you very much, Claire, for sharing that story with us. Appreciate it. This month, our Share the Plate partner is the Tennessee Equality Project. The Tennessee Equality Project Foundation provides educational and awareness programming in Tennessee to advance the inclusion and equality of gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender people in our state. They monitor and analyze state legislation related to the LGBTQ community, conduct voter registration, advocacy training, sensitivity training, and work against bullying. They also educate the public about state preemption of local government. The TEP Foundation lists mental health providers in Tennessee who do not discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity, and who provide affirmative services in regards to sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. The Counseling Discrimination Law, passed in 2016, highlights the need for counselors, therapists, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and other mental health providers who engage in inclusive and affirmative practices. The TEP Foundation holds Borough Pride in Murfreesboro annually, which in recent years has attracted over 4,000 participants. I ask you to please give generously this month to our Share the Plate partner, the Tennessee Equality Project Foundation. You can donate online, via text, or by check by following the instructions listed on the screen. As always, we appreciate your generosity. Our next hymn is number 9, No Longer Forward Nor Behind. Jess Hudeman is performing on the video. Enjoy.
Good morning. In case you don't know, I am the Reverend Denise Couch, and I am the minister of the Greater Nashville Unitarian Universalist Congregation. And it is so much fun to be in the sanctuary with congregants. It's a great day, and I hope that more and more of you will come as we get our act together here in the sanctuary. And we are so happy to be able to continue doing hybrid services so that people can join us from anywhere they are. And we thank you for your patience as we work out the kinks in our technology and our welcome. So our theme for this month is holding history. And I'm trained as a historian, so I love history. I tend to really enjoy it, and I read all kinds of things and find it all fascinating. And history is really fun when you have good stories to tell that are uplifting and inspiring. But there are lots and lots of stories in our history, lots of bits and pieces of things. As a nation, as a continent, as a world, as a congregation, there are things about who we have been that we are less than proud of, things we would not like to repeat, things we would like to avoid. And sometimes we have these things just in life in general. As we all know, we all got a crash course in things that are hard this last couple of years. And it can be a little overwhelming sometimes. So today, I don't want to explore all the things that are hard. I'm going to assume you know what things are hard for you, historically, personally, in your own lives. But I want us to think about how we might learn to hold even what is hard. Our culture tends to always be looking for the positive, to be reaching for what's better, to be improving. We have a belief, we tend to, in our culture, of progressivism. Everything gets better and better and better all the time. And some things do, many things do, thank goodness. And sometimes things don't. So how do we hold everything that is our history, is our life together, is our personal lives? How do we hold all of it instead of trying to just focus on the good things and push away the bad? Because that pushing away the bad, ignoring it, refusing to think through or deal with or reckon with the things that are difficult, gets us in trouble sometimes. Repressing emotions come out other places. You all know this, I'm sure, from experience. So how do we hold the information we have, the knowledge we have, that sometimes I am not my best person? Sometimes we as a group are not the best congregation we could be. Sometimes in our past, the people who have come before us have not been the best they could be. The white colonial settlers on the North American continent were certainly not the most human they could be overall, as our story for all ages this morning shows. It also shows a moving on beyond that history, which I really appreciate. And I'm so glad that Claire chose that story for us this morning. So how do we learn to hold what has been bad or is hard and move into being more human and living in alignment with our values? Well, there's lots of things that can help. I think questions are really important. And I think having the hard things in our lives leads to questions, and this is where it gets hard. They're questions we don't have really easy answers for. We can't come to those answers quickly. So when I think of the questions that arise when we face the hard parts of history, like how many people on this continent have been brought here against their will and enslaved? How many people have been displaced from land that was theirs because somebody just thought, oh, they don't really do ownership, so let's us do it. We own this now, thank you. So when you encounter these things in our stories, and many times, let's also acknowledge the history that we are learning now is very different from what many of us learned in school. Left out huge chunks of history. So these harder parts of history lead to really obvious questions like, well, so how do we live with this? How do I live knowing that I can yell at my child or slap my child if I get angry enough? How do I hold that? This is not who I want to be. How do we decide what to do next when we acknowledge that white people have held privilege, and not just held the privilege, but abused the privilege to exploit other people on this continent? So what do we do now? How do we hold this? How do we live with this? How do we live with this knowledge? So what helps is curiosity. Sometimes that's sort of my academically trained brain goes to curiosity, but that works really well for a lot of us, especially if you think of it as not looking for the truth, but always looking for more nuances, more questions. Okay, so if that's a little different, what else might be different from what I thought it was? Looking for balance. If you look at an individual person, they're very rarely all good or all evil, right? So what in history has been useful and good and inspiring, and what in our history has been regrettable or shameful? What damage has been done that needs to be repaired? How can we find a way to balance all of that, to draw on the strengths of what has gone well, what we have been that has been admirable, to balance the hurt and the harm to ourselves and to others and to the planet? How do we balance all of that? And then there's a certain measure of empathy and acceptance, which I often think are actually kind of the same thing. But that's another sermon, maybe. How do we just hold everything? So, and let me say this too. One of the things I think is very difficult about the time we live in now is that we have a constant, unending stream of information, new information. So sometimes that, new information about what is hard is coming at us all the time. And so I would like to encourage you to be intentional about when and how much of that you take in, because not reading that story today does not mean you will not think about it tomorrow. And sometimes we have to pace ourselves or decide, I'm going to focus on this because there are billions of other people in the world, and some of them are doing this thing and paying attention to that problem and working on this part. So we cannot, each of us, be aware of and responsible for everything. So, but these are all things, sort of big picture things. And I want to suggest a couple of ideas that I think might help. Are actually a couple of ideas to explore, to open up, unpack, and maybe think about making a shift in how we think about them that I think would help. But before we do this, because all of this is actually spiritual practice, all of this, all of how we interact with the world and how we can learn to do it more effectively with greater alignment with our own values comes back, really, I have to say this because I'm a minister, it comes back to spiritual practice. So I'm going to invite you now into a guided meditation of sorts. It's a little bit of a spiritual practice, and it's one that you can do anytime, anywhere. I learned it from an online teacher and coach named Jennifer Loudon, but I find it really useful sometimes. And this is something that involves your body. So if you're comfortable where you are, I encourage you to sort of follow along with this. And what I'm going to be doing is directing your attention inward, just to yourself, okay? So first, I want you to, if you're willing, to focus your attention on a spot in the middle of your brain, okay? This is all imaginative, but in the middle of your brain. And it might help if you put a hand on your forehead and one on the back of your head, or maybe the top of your head and the base of your neck. Do whatever feels right to you. And just focus on that point. You could close your eyes or not, as you wish. And see if you can just feel your way into that spot in the very center of your brain. And just be there with yourself. Nobody else's ideas or questions, just yourself. Maybe take a few deep breaths. Just in the center of your brain, the most basic part. Some of you know exactly where that is. I don't. I'm imagining the center. And then we're going to move down to a point in the center of your chest. And you might want to put a hand behind you, in the back of your, maybe, the middle of your back or in between your shoulder blades if you're agile enough to reach that far. And maybe on the front of your chest, your sternum. And reach for a point. If you like, you can imagine it in the middle of your heart or in the middle of your chest behind your sternum. And be there in yourself. Nobody else's feelings matter right now. How is it inside the center of your chest? You may feel your heart breathing, your lungs working. Just be there with yourself. And finally, I'm going to move down sort of below your waist. Find the spot in your imagination that's in the middle of your belly. So you might want to feel the chair behind you or put a hand down on your lower back and a hand on your belly. A lot of us don't love well enough, but go ahead, love it today. Put your hand there, and can you imagine in the middle of your pelvic bowl, just sort of above that? Where are you in your center? Right there. Just you. And now see if you can hold that awareness in the center of your belly. And then hold that, still aware of you down low. Can you then also add an awareness of the center of your chest? And hold both of those. And then add your awareness of the center of your brain. So you have this huge axis of the three main parts of your body that we know increasingly all work together to be about who you are. So these centers of you, can you just be with yourself for a few deep breaths? And slowly, when you're ready, you can move your hands or leave them wherever feels good. If you've closed your eyes, maybe open them and come back into the room here in the sanctuary or into the Zoom room with us. And so here's when I'm in the best, most centered part of myself. Some of the things I think that might help me stay in that best, most centered part of myself when I'm looking out at the world and all the things, good and hard, that I encounter. So our theme for the month is holding history. So I want to suggest we reframe what it means to hold. Okay. I think in our culture, holding has this overtone of grasping. Hold on, just hold on, you'll get there. Hold on, right? Grasping or struggling for things. We clench. We clench a lot because we're afraid a lot, I think. But holding can also be what a bowl does. An open. Hands can do this too. We can be an open. I can hold water in my hand if I pay attention to what I'm doing, right? So what if holding history was more about being a bowl than it was about struggling? It is hard, and you have to pay attention, but maybe we don't have to grasp after the perfect solutions for the hard things, the perfect ways to repair the harm that we know is real. Maybe we can think like a bowl and hold. A bowl, a cup, the ocean holds too. So I think we are often not just more resilient than we think, but more large. We are bigger than we often give ourselves credit for, individually and as communities. So I invite you just to think about that when you think about holding the hard things in your life and in history. The second thing I wanted to talk about a little was our sense of chronology, timeline, ancestors and descendants, especially. A curious thing has happened. Well, it isn't curious, but I find it very interesting as I'm watching the Unitarian Universalist movement, as we are incorporating more and more voices from Indigenous and African American people of color, and other voices that have been traditionally outside the mainstreams of power. Some of the language that we are being exposed to in worship, I'm thinking of a General Assembly especially, is taking on some different stories, some different messages about who we are in time and history. For example, there was a service I went to last summer on Zoom at General Assembly, in which one of the speakers talked about ancestors and descendants. And I was at a workshop several years ago, almost all white people in the room, but we talked, somebody speaking to us at some point spoke about ancestors and descendants and pointed out that we usually think of our ancestors as being in our past, behind us, physically behind us, and our descendants in front of us. And so then, the ancestors are this. There's the temptation when you're thinking about the hard things in history, for example, the ancestors are behind us and we are grasping at the future, struggling to get somewhere else, to fix what needs fixing, to mend, to heal. And we are hoping that our descendants won't hate us. There's a lot of shame right now in our culture about what will our children and our children's children think of the world we've left for them. But what if we thought of the ancestors as being in front of us? They have walked a path we are on. They went ahead of us. And so we're not entirely having to forge our own way all the time. We have support and encouragement from those who have gone before. People in other cultures, not white America so much, but in other cultures within the American project, talk about the ancestors and lean on the ancestors and call on the ancestors and feel the ancestors as a support. We could learn to do that too. We could. We don't often. But it's another way of thinking. And then our descendants, maybe they're coming up behind us. They're not out front somewhere we can't quite get to, waiting to show us how we have failed to get to where they need to be. But they're behind us and they're leaning on us. And this particular speaker suggested that our role is to just hold the space for change. We're not responsible for making everything right for the people who come after us. Nobody has been born into a perfect, easy world. how do we hold the space? He says, I hear my great grandchildren and they're saying, just hold the space. We're coming. We're coming. So how do we then, we can walk behind ancestors who were imperfect and be imperfect and hold space for change. And it will be enough, perhaps, for our descendants who will come and they will inherit an imperfect world just as all of us ahead of them on the path have done. Could that be okay? Could we be all right with that? I would like to think we could. And I think perhaps without the burden of shame and guilt and this sense of having to be perfect, we will actually, I think, be more effective at creating the change that we want to see for ourselves and that we want to set up for the people who come after us. So I'm wondering how we hold on to these are shifts just in attitude. These are not practical things I'm asking you to do. I'm just asking you, maybe think about what the word hold means. Maybe think about where the ancestors are in relationship to you, where the descendants are. And part of the reason I wanted you to do this is I have a poem about leaves and about leaves falling, which is good for the fall, right? But it was used by a speaker at a workshop I was just at recently. And I'm thinking whatever you felt or didn't feel, but maybe thought about, however you encountered it, the center of you, maybe this is like a tree. There is something that is you, that is rooted in the ground, that reaches up, that is habitat for other things, other creatures and beings. And maybe some parts of you change all the time, like the leaves, they grow, they drop off, but maybe we're not our leaves. Maybe we're not our stories, our histories. They come from us, they nourish us, they serve a purpose. They help us get the nutrients out of life, get the good stuff so we can stay alive and grow bigger and more branches and more leaves. But maybe it's okay that things fall away. Maybe this is part of learning to live gracefully with history, is to be grateful for what nourishes and supports and holds up, and also okay with the fact that some things fall away. So this is an African-American poet named Lucille Clifton. She has a poem called The Lesson of the Falling Leaves. And let me say, the word God is in here. And I want you to know the poet doesn't capitalize it. And we're Unitarian Universalists, so we can do as we wish with that concept of God. It's just a word. We all have a bigger, something that is big, that holds everything. So, the falling leaves. The leaves believe, such letting go is love. Such love is faith. Such faith is grace. Such grace is God. I agree with the leaves. So maybe letting go is a part of the big picture we need to live into. Letting go, but knowing that falling leaves don't mean there isn't anything here. They don't mean we don't have a central core, individually or together. So it is safe to hold whatever there is to hold in our lives. And it's a lot sometimes. Sometimes we're called to make our bowl a lot bigger than this singing bowl here. Some days this can hold everything I need. Some days I need to be an ocean. And you do too. But it can be okay. Letting go, accepting is love, and love is faith, and faith is everything. Faith is grace. So let's watch the leaves. Let's see, what do we need to let go of? What do we need to hold, and how can we hold it more gracefully? And what do we do with all those questions? I like to think those the really hard, the unanswerable questions. How do we live with this or that thing we know to be true about us or our people or our histories? where are we called to go next? All of those are questions without really quick, easy answers. Can we hold them loosely? Can we try some answers, grow a few, sprout a few leaves, see if they nourish us? And if they don't, let them go, let them fall. The falling is part of loving too. So there's some ways that I think, maybe you can think about, we could talk later. How do we hold these questions that our history, that our lives give to us? And the other thing I want to say, we have each other. We always have each other. So when things are hard, when life is hard, when the history is hard, we can do this together. The congregation can hold us too. So I invite you always to lean into that, to call on each other, to call me. By the way, if you haven't heard, I'd love to meet you. I'm slowly meeting the congregation. I want to do more of that. But always the questions, the curiosity, and the being gentle with ourselves. And remember to connect with who you are out inside without everybody else. Once in a while, it's a good thing to do. And here ends the sermon. But we have, Scott has picked out a hymn for us. And I invite you to practice holding some of these perennial questions as we sing. Well, you can sing along at home if you would like to. If you're in the sanctuary, you can hum. We'll all have our masks on, so we can hum. That's fine. This is an old favorite of many Unitarian Universalists. So it's hymn number 1003. Where do we come from? Performed today by Bob Ford, Kim Bywater, and Melissa Bartlett.
And now we've come to our time of joys and concerns. For those of you joining us on YouTube today,